good day. My name is Nadia McConnell. This year, America celebrates 250 years of independence. Most Americans know about the founders of the United States, Washington, Jefferson, John Adams, Ben Franklin, and how they defeated the British Empire against all odds. Today, August 24, Ukraine celebrates 35 years of independence. How many Ukrainians can name the founders of Ukraine's independence and how they strategically outsmarted Gorbachev and the communists without firing a single shot? Defeat the enemy against all odds? Our panelists today, John Gunderson, Irene Jarosewich, Robert McConnell, and I were eyewitnesses to the multifaceted and multi-year process of establishing Ukraine's independence. Robert will speak about some of the important events before 1991 that helped lay the foundation for Ukraine's independence. John will speak from the perspective of how the American government influenced and reacted to the process. And Irene, who was in Ukraine in 91, will speak about some key elements on the ground in Ukraine. An important element that must be mentioned that is not well understood is that beyond Ukraine's aspiration of independence in theory, the Ukrainian diaspora worldwide had over several decades built political advocacy efforts to constantly push for Ukraine's independence. America, which had one of the largest Ukrainian American communities, at the time more frequently referred to not as diaspora, but simply Ukrainian Americans, and among ourselves, Hromada, had lobbied to establish a monument to Taras Shevchenko on federal land in Washington, D.C., through Congress, established Captive Nations Week, lobbied for the release of Ukrainian political prisoners through organizations such as AHRU, and national umbrella organizations such as Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, Ukrainian National Association, Ukrainian National Women's League, focused on the recognition of the Holodomor, aid to the victims of Chernobyl, public recognition of the millennium of Christianity in Ukraine, and never-ending battles against Soviet disinformation in academia, the media, and government. Today's approach to the topic of Ukraine's independence from three perspectives is an effort not only to inform and educate about the long, complex, and strategic efforts to achieve independence, but also as a firm rebuke to the very simplistic notion that independence just happened. It did not. It was not just an angry reaction to the coup in Moscow, a cause and effect, so to speak. This simplistic explanation that most unfortunately has been gaining ground is, in all of our opinions, another form of Moscow disinformation. That all-powerful Moscow actually caused, mistakenly, but still caused Ukraine's independence, therefore now has the right to take it back. This train of thought is insidious because it does what Moscow loves to do best. It removes all and any agency from Ukraine or Ukrainians, even declaring their independence if it had not been for the misguided putsch in Russia. Today, President Zelensky, in his greeting to Ukraine, talked about the secret weapon that Putin didn't count on, and that was the people of Ukraine. Today, the people of Ukraine stand on the shoulders of those who brought independence to Ukraine and all of the generations beforehand who fought for this idea of an independent Ukraine. While today's panel can in no way be considered as comprehensive, nevertheless, we believe it will be most informative. Robert, please.
Well, thank you, Nadia. You hit on a number of activities that had energized the advocacy of Ukrainian Americans community leading up to the September 1989 establishment in Ukraine of Rukh, the popular movement for the restructuring of Ukraine. A month later, October 1989, Vladimir Yavayuski visited the United States and spent several days in Washington. He was a communist member of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR and a member of Rukh, a very engaging personality. This made him quite a curiosity to us, a communist and a member of Rukh. Much of his discussion focused on the upcoming March 1990 parliamentary elections, the first in Soviet Ukraine that would allow non-communists to run for office. At a dinner celebrating his 47th birthday in D.C., Jarosewich requested two things from us: for us to get a group of congressional observers to Ukraine for the March elections, and for a program whereby members of Rukh who might get elected to the Rada in March could learn about the American system of governance. He said they would not be interested in copying the American system, but they knew they had always been lied to about America and would like to know how our system actually worked. With the help of Senator Dennis DeConcini, Democrat of Arizona, and then the chair of the Helsinki Committee in Congress, we pulled together 16 members of the House of Representatives to go to Ukraine for the elections. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney saw to it that the group would have a plane. Unfortunately, on the Friday before the Sunday elections, as the congressional delegation was boarding their plane at Joint Base Andrews, word came from the Soviets that they had changed their mind and they were going to deny the Air Force plane rights to enter Soviet airspace. DeConcini called me as I was finishing packing to go to Dulles for my flight to tell me the delegation was on its way back to Capitol Hill and why. Nadia, who was already in Kyiv, and Rukh did not know what happened to the expected congressional delegation until I arrived Saturday evening. I won't go into it now, but we were more successful in meeting Jarosewich and Rukh's other request. We, Nadia's small consulting firm, teaming with the Indiana University, held a 2-week conference on the American system of governance for 13 members of the Rada, 11 Democrats and 2 communists. 1 week in Indiana learning state, county, and local governance, and a week in Washington of intense sessions with all 3 branches of our government. Senators, congressmen, senior staffers, executive branch officials, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. They got quite a review of American governance. But I think the point needing to be made, for which Nadia laid the groundwork, is that by the time Rukh began building Ukraine's civil society's movement away from the center, as the Kremlin was seen and referred to at the time, the Ukrainian American community was ready to support their efforts. If I recall correctly, more than 50 local Rukh committees were formed: Rukh Chicago, Cleveland Rukh, Los Angeles Rukh, and so on. The Washington Rukh Committee was the only one with a different name. It was Ukraine 2000, and it essentially was the government relations coordinator for the American advocacy for Rukh. Most of the committees raised funds, collected supplies to send to Rukh, and with the guidance from Ukraine 2000, petitioned our legislative and executive branches in support of what was happening in Ukraine. Any adequate review of their combined efforts would take hours, but the point is, Rukh had an active, loud, and nationwide lobbying team here in the United States. I'll stop for that right now, and we'll go on.
Irene, I think it's very important for people to understand, as I said, independence didn't just happen. It was led by what I consider to be the most strategic organization in Ukraine's modern history. And Irene, if you could take us through that, how they outsmarted Gorbachev and the communists.
Okay, thank you. I'm actually going to read my remarks, and I'm going to read them quickly. Robert, one of the things we'll just mention right off the bat, one of the reasons why Ukraine 2000 received the name Ukraine 2000 was because in September 1990, Mikhailo Horing, who was a member of Rukh, a former Soviet dissident, spoke at a conference in Washington, D.C., in which he flatly stated to an audience of several hundred people, Ukraine will be independent in 10 years. So, doing simple math, we added 10 years to 1990 and came up with Ukraine 2000. And Mikhailo Horing really deserves credit for giving us that name. He deserves a lot more credit too, but anyway, let's go on. Hold on. Okay. So while we've spoken of support for the diaspora, and before I speak on the ground in Ukraine, I would like to add a point to Robert's comments, and one of that is money. Between 1989 and 1992, the Ukrainian diaspora, which included not only the United States, but Canada, Australia, Great Britain, almost all European countries, and Latin America, Brazil, and Argentina, provided millions of dollars of support, cash, equipment, supplies, medical aid, and treatments to Rukh. The money had to come from somewhere, and it wasn't in Ukraine. Rukh had a 3-story headquarters in a pretty central location of Kyiv, and for sure, the city of Kyiv did not rent it to them for free. Staff needed to be paid, buses needed to be chartered, salaries of several dozen employees, security, that was a big expense. And that doesn't even include the lobbying efforts that the diaspora did with their own national governments to fund exchanges, educational tours, etc. So, when Moscow accused, quote, the West of supporting Ukraine's independence movements, they were not completely wrong. It was not direct financing from foreign governments, but it was thousands of visitors bringing in $10 and $20, $100 bills sewed into their waistbands or in other parts of their clothing, suitcases filled with fax paper and toner, printer, medications, and so on. It is important to underscore that the support of the diaspora was not only in the physical lobbying effort and in the knowledge, but actually was a very strong financial support for Rukh.
So, Irena, just you're talking about this contribution. Yes. Also, I think we need to mention we were able to secure funding from the National Endowment for Democracy, where they were able to purchase a printer, a substantial printer. So as you know, we accessed whatever resources we could find in support of these efforts.
Yes, and that needs to be, that often is not considered, but it really was with the financial support that Rukh was able to operate. They were able to do their extensive lobbying within Ukraine because of the resources that were provided by the diaspora. I will start with September 1989, the establishment of Rukh, the popular movement of Ukraine. Ukraine was established, as Robert mentioned, by communists, full-fledged card-carrying party members. Yes, there were several Soviet dissidents, absolutely not downplaying their role in September of 1989. In fact, Mikhailo Horing was crucial because of his personal relationship with poet Ivan Drach and professional relationship of trust with poet Dmytro Pavlichko. Mikhailo Horing's shrewdness in the most positive senses, deserves an entire book, at least a research dissertation. However, it is Mikhail Gorbachev who turned to the writers' unions at all the republics with appeals to the liberal communist intelligentsia to help him popularize his policies of glasnost and perestroika. That openness and rebuilding of the form in the Soviet Union, not independence, but reform. He did so in a private meeting with the heads of the various writers' unions in 1986 and quite publicly in his New Year's address in 1988. The two writers' unions that acted decisively were Sąjūdis, the reform movement of Lithuania, in the summer of 1988, and Narodny Ruch Ukrainy za Perestroiku, the popular movement of Ukraine for perestroika, the official name of the organization that was established in Kyiv in September 1989. It was a loose coalition led by members of the writers' unions, such as Volodymyr Yavoritsky, Vyacheslav Brychovetsky, Ivan Drach, Dmytro Pavlichko, Yuri Shcherbak, Yuri Badzio, my husband Alexander Borkovsky, and many others who went forth with the message, we too believe that the Soviet Union should be reformed, that the control of our lives should not come just top down from the CP leadership in Moscow, but must include agency for all citizens and also be bottom up. Spring 1989 was spent organizing for the planned conference in September, organizing local chapters, motivating branches of language societies such as Towarystvo Ukrainy, using resources of the Writers' Union such as the newspaper Literaturna Ukraina, and projects such as the Shalom Aleichem Society to inform Ukrainians in all oblasts to select and brief their delegates. This is where the influence of the former Soviet dissidents actually played played an important role. While people such as Mikhailo Khoring and Stepan Khmarov, Vyacheslav Chornovil, Levko Lukyanenko, Ivan Hel, and Nikolai Nsi were not uber convinced that they wanted to become bedfellows with liberal communists, they did see the establishment of Rukh as an opportunity to push for their agenda. Ultimately, the independence of Ukraine, but for now, at least sovereignty. In fact, a coalition of the Democratic Bloc, which included many former dissidents and liberal communists in parliament, passed a declaration of Ukraine's sovereignty in July of 1990, 11 months before the Declaration of Independence. The former dissidents were also crucial during the second conference of Rukh in the fall of 1990, when the words for perestroika were officially dropped from the name of the organization. Let's fast forward to August of 1991. The disappointing August 1st suicidal nationalism given by President Bush received a scathing rebuke from Rukh leader Ivan Drach at a press conference held shortly after the speech was given. Drach also met with New York Times columnist William Safire for a good period of time, privately in his writer union's office same day. Safire, in a column shortly thereafter, dubbed Bush's speech Chicken Cave, thereby ensuring that moment and that moniker a permanent place in Ukraine's history. Earlier in the year, Ukraine's parliament had already voted to create the position of president of Ukrainian USSR, to take away some of the authority from the one and all-encompassing president of the USSR. And Ukraine's presidential election was set for December 1, 1991. With the establishment of Rukh in 1989, the March 1990 elections, during which non-communist party candidates won almost half the seats in parliament, the July 1990 Declaration of Ukraine's sovereignty, the statement by Mikhailo Khoring at a conference in Washington, D.C. in September 1990, where he said with confidence that Ukraine would be independent in 10 years, were all contributing factors that led to August 24th. The August 1991 coup, in the heat of the summer when everybody was out on vacation, was a stunner. That said, Rukh called for an emergency meeting of its leaderships, and by 8 p.m., 3 statements had been written and distributed. A statement that Rukh categorically refused to recognize the authority of the State Emergency Committee, the 3 coup leaders in Moscow, an appeal to the government and parliament of Ukraine to reject the coup as well, an appeal to the people of Ukraine to stand fast against the coup. And I also have it on good authority. I did not hear it myself directly, but I have it on good authority, that earlier that day on the 19th, Mikhailo Khoring, who was in medical treatment in Lviv, called his good friend Ivan Drach from the hospital and told him that Rukh should call for a special sessions of parliament and that this was going to be a good opportunity to at least call for independence. The decision was also accepted at that afternoon meeting. However, signatures of two-thirds of the members of parliament were required. So a team from Rukh, which included the Metropovlichka, went into negotiations with the communist members. And if Kyiv went out, that there would be a special session, and all the deputies were required to show up at Kyiv on Saturday the 24th, and a lot of them had no idea why they were coming. And the Den Bloc members of parliament and their assistants drove around literally to all the dachas to obtain these signatures. And the Kyiv included the fact that all communist party members needed to sign this petition. The required number of signatures was obtained by Wednesday afternoon, August 21st. A victorious Volodymyr Filenko and Alexander Yemets walked into Rukh's traditional Wednesday afternoon press conference at the Writers' Union, waving a sheet of paper announcing, "We got it. Маємо." Nobody involved with Rukh really slept much the next 2 days. The entire run of show for August 24 needed to be negotiated with Ukrainian Communist Party leadership. Dmytro Pavlychko took the lead, receiving support from others including Igor Yakhnovsky. There was some tension from the non-Rukh but pro-independence deputies. Members of the Ukrainian Republican Party, such as Lukyanenko, Khmara, felt that they should take the lead on independence. It was their cause. But this is all too much detail to get into right now. But in the end, no, Rukh did the negotiations. The negotiations were both the terms, the language, who would actually read the declaration on the floor for the proposed vote. The Dem Bloc knew that they did not have the required number of votes, so they needed the communists, and the communists were really displeased with what they saw was going on in Moscow. The coup ending, Gorbachev returning, the rapid rise of the populist Yeltsin. And the Russia Duma was also meeting on Saturday the 24th. So they too, meaning they, the Ukrainian communists, wanted protection against a possible backlash from Moscow. The agreement was to hold a referendum to confirm the declaration in conjunction with the already planned presidential election on December 1. The Dem Bloc and the Rukh were convinced that they would receive the popular support from the voters, and they wanted legitimate affirmation that this proclamation made on the 24th was not unilateral. And the communists wanted to buy some time and a possible way out if it was needed. As people's deputies straggled into parliament on the morning of the 24th, arriving by overnight train from faraway places, a quorum was not reached until late morning. However, the final terms were still being hammered out. Ivan Plyush, who was chairing the session, called for a recess. The communists were meeting in the auditorium on the ground floor. Several of us went in there to listen, since we already knew what the Dems were going to do, so why listen to them? After some blah blah, the side entrance to the auditorium opened, and Dmytro Pavlychko, and I'm going to say he almost skipped down the aisle to the front and handed Alexander Moroz, who was then leading the session, a piece of paper. Moroz, who had developed a good working relationship with Pavlychko, read the text that was handed to him, looked at Pavlychko, and then turned and simply nodded to the head of the Communist Party of Ukraine, Stanislav Huren, as to say, we got what we wanted, we have what we needed. After which Hurenko, a tall, very large man, slowly rose from about 10 rows back, from his seat 10 rows back, and said a few words, something, and then announced, Tovarishi, comrades, today we will do something that we did not expect to ever do. Today we will vote for Ukraine's independence. The end.
Well, thank you, Irena, for taking us inside the room and what happened. We all have been blessed to have been witnesses and be there for some of these very important moments. You painted the picture of how all this, actually occurred on the 24th. But I want to now turn to John Gunderson. It was the first representative from the United States in Ukraine. And I want him to talk about how he was prepared going to Ukraine, and then how his views were influenced by what the events that he saw, and how he tried to transmit some of this to Washington. So, John, please walk us through that whole process.
All right. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Robert and Irina, for what you guys have done. And everybody who's done something. A quick shout out to my wife who's in Ukraine now delivering medical equipment and watching. So you guys are the real heroes. So what's happening back in Washington? Let me take you back to the end of the Cold War, and I think we can remember it, some people can't. So Reagan and Bush are elected. Reagan talks about the evil empire, can't deal with the Soviet Union. And he says, the people I work with are dying. Brezhnev dies, Chernenko dies, Gorbachev comes in, and Gorbachev is a little different. So he's doing glasnost, openness, perestroika, restructuring, and Reagan and Bush are beginning to do treaties with them. They sign an arms control treaty eliminating all nuclear weapons in Europe, confidence building measures. I worked on that treaty. And Bush says when he takes over in November 88, I can work with this guy. So we open up an embassy, a consulate, which is still part of the Soviet Union. How many really believed in 1989-90 the Soviet Union would fall apart? So we opened up a consulate, just me and John Stepanchuk and one or two others. And we were charged. I get a mandate, said, go there, ears to the ground, tell us what's happening in Ukraine. Talk to people. Make sure you talk to all elements. So we go to the West, Lviv, we go to Odessa, we go to Donbass. We start getting a sense of what you're thinking. Now, I'm somebody who studied Russian. I had been a junior officer in Moscow in the late 70s. So I had no prejudice about Ukrainian independence. I started to realize Ukraine did not want to be part of the Soviet Union. And Washington didn't like that. Embassy Moscow didn't like that because they were dealing with Gorbachev. They were signing agreements and nukes and things like that. And they wanted to deal with one person, one center. So my cables were not greeted warmly back in Washington, and I was clashing heads with the ambassador in Moscow. And I was just a reporting officer. I was not advocating independence. In fact, I was told when I went to Ukraine, do not mention the word independence. You can talk about human rights, rule of law, markets, even sovereignty. Be careful with that. Do not mention independence. So I was reporting back to Washington. They're getting a little worried. So President Bush comes to Kyiv, or Kiev as it was called in Russian, in August 1, 1991. He arrives. First, he goes to Moscow. He goes to Gorbachev's dacha, and he talks about Gorbachev. He's very happy talking with him. Comes down. He's greeted very warmly. They're hoping there'll be a change in American position or a modification. And I don't get to see the speech he gives that Irina refers to, the chicken Kiev or chicken Kyiv speech. An hour before, I look at it and it says suicidal nationalism. It says freedom does not mean independence. And I say, well, how can you say that? If you have freedom, you can vote on independence. So I went back to the writer of the speech to go to the president. Now, I'd only greeted him very briefly and talked to him briefly. Please ask the president not to use those terms. They said, thank you very much. And he used them. Quick anecdote, if I might. I was in Norway right before Bush is to land because I'm getting married in Norway. The day of my marriage, or the day before, you've got to come back to Kyiv because the president of the United States is coming. So I tell my wife, I have to leave. She said, what's your excuse? I said, I got to meet the president. And she says very diplomatically, that's such a bullshit excuse. But anyway, so I go back right away. I get to Kyiv, and he used his bombshell speech. And unfortunately, that's picked up by everybody in Sapphire and the New York Times, who, by the way, was maybe one of the most respected journalists in the United States at the time. And of course, what happens is the coup happens. I'll go quickly. I won't talk about that, and we can talk about that later. And Yanayev, who was the head of the coup, had come down to Kyiv with Bush to make sure what happened in Kyiv does not change things. So I have pictures of myself, Yanayev, Bush, and Kravchuk, who was a nationalist communist, and they were worried what would happen. So
You might tell people who Inayev was.
Yanayev was the titular head of the coup. It was Akhrameyev, who was the military guy, and a Soviet KGB type, Khrushchev, and they engineered the coup because they were worried about the reforms the Soviet Union fall apart. They overthrow Gorbachev quickly, and I think the initial thinking was that trip down to Kyiv in August 1, 1991. So they have the coup. The coup fails because they're such, fools. They didn't really organize it. But Washington was still interested in working with the reformed Soviet Union. And what we were saying is, well, reforms are good. Glasnost, perestroika, all those are good ideas. But if you have a reformed Soviet Union, then you can vote. Then you have democracy, and then they leave the country. So there's a contradiction of terms between a reformed Soviet Union. And Bush did not like that. He liked working with Gorbachev in this period, and then Yeltsin. But it took a long time to convince him. We had visits in 4 months. We had visits of Nixon, Brzezinski, Kissinger, the Foreign Relations Committee, which included a young Biden and an old Strom Thurmond. And they began to realize Ukraine was going to be independent. And we were fortunate because the Ukrainians I met with Kravchuk, the communist leader, over 10 times. How often does the consul general meet the president of the country? And Rukh, these people, Khoren and Drach and Pavlichko, and they weren't guys who were looking for power. They were interested in a Ukraine, what sort of country Ukraine would be. And that was different than many other coups or many other independence movements. And we were reporting that back in Washington. And eventually Washington accepted the fact that Ukraine would become an independent country.
John, staying with the Chicken Kiev speech, which I thought was a gift, actually, because but for that speech, I think the report about Bush's trip to Ukraine would have been 1 or 2 sentences. But I think what's important here also, how the interplay with the community here in Washington and with Irena there working on Rukh. So Robert, maybe say you were tracking the whatever the cables or the press conferences. Do you want to tell that story?
Oh, and Nadia, you're going to make me come out as the author. The week that Bush was in Moscow with Gorbachev, every afternoon the White House press office was having a briefing about what was going on and so forth. And I can't recall what was said, but each day the tone was changing and changing. And I knew he was going to be going to Kyiv. And by Friday, I was very angry, as you can recall, because by that time, I really had the sense, I could have been wrong, but I turned out to be right, that what he was going to be saying in Kiev, that he was going to speak to the Rada and try and put the kibosh on where Rukh and Ukraine was going. And I got so mad that Friday night I wrote a speech in rebuttal to what I thought he would say. And I fired it off by the cumbersome email of the time to Kiev. And I don't remember whether Irene translated it or our guy Ivan Lozovet translated it and gave it to Drach. Well, Saturday morning, I woke up and looked at it and thought, boy, if I actually was going to give that, I'd have to tone it down a bit. Well, on Monday, Bush gave his
Take
speech.
it away, Irena, about receiving the speech that Robert wrote and how, getting Drach to give it and how you corralled some of the correspondents who were attending the official briefing of Bush press secretary and to get them to the Writers Union for the Rukh press conference.
Okay, Robert, I'll just insert it for a minute. Yes, so Robert's speech was strong. Let's put it that way. But the August 1st speech, John was I don't know if we can sort of transmit the sense of what a dud it was. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was total, I won't say total silence, but it was just profound disappointment in Parliament. And what happened is that immediately afterwards, Rukh called a press conference. Our standard meeting place for all press conferences was the auditorium of the Writers Union. And all, the Ukrainian correspondents that were in place and some of the Moscow correspondents that were permanently in Kyiv knew exactly where to go, what to do, etc. But there was a whole entire White House press corps that we wanted, at least some of them, to get there, except that Roman Popodyuk, who was the deputy press secretary at the time, bluntly herded them all into what was then the trade union building on Khreshchatyk and began debriefing all of them, explaining what Bush really meant by the speech, because they all understood that it was a dud, and, kind of backpedaling. Well, I'm not part of the White House press corps, and I'm not supposed to be in that building. However, I speak fluent English, and two of us fooled the security guards and walked right in. And we knew what we wanted to do was convince people to come, but there wasn't enough chairs set up, so a lot of them were sitting on the floors, with their back against the wall, writing their notes. Some of them had some, computers, laptops, and so. What I had to do, because I couldn't stand over them, so I crouched down like a little frog or something, and began moving from one to the other, going, listen, you need to go to the Writers Union building. Just get into a cab. Tell them you need to go to Writers Union, Spilka Pisimennik. I forgot the name of the street. I told them, and I said, and there's a much more interesting press conference going on up there. I said, Rukh is organizing. I move on to the next person. I said, you really need to go to this interesting press conference. And a few of them actually showed up and straggled in. But that's the fun story. That is how we got. That was part of the reaction, is that we already from the very beginning, we being Rukh, thanks to Robert's really very strong speech, had already put the kibosh on Bush's presentation to the Rada.
And it shows,
because Drach, he didn't change my speech. He gave my speech word for word. And I was kind of shocked when I heard that.
But what that shows is the difference between the reality on the ground, which is often the case, and the Rada. People wanted to applaud the speech. He was the president of the United States. It's the first meeting or visit by a U.S. president since Nixon in 1973. And yet it was such a dud. And yet those who wrote the speech, and it reflected the thinking by the majority in Washington at the time. Even though, and I was in contact with some people at Defense, some people at State who disagreed. So history is not one easy or linear line. There are these differences of opinion. And at that time, the White House, Embassy Moscow, did not like the fact that Ukraine was moving towards independence. By December 1, after the election, after the referendum, 92 point somethings voted for independence. They realized they needed to change. But it was only those sobering events that did that.
I did want to follow up, because this is what I want to say originally before, because I thought John was speaking in front of me. And this is a very important point. Absolutely, I assure you, from Rukh, everybody wanted to greet the president warmly. They really were excited that he was coming. They saw it as a sort of like a form of legitimacy, and they couldn't imagine otherwise. But here's what I want to say about the youth and Rukh leaders and Ukrainian people in general. They looked to the United States as the guiding star of democracy. It was politically strategic to do so. However, the United States was seen as the most important country in the world for the success of Ukraine's independence. But it was also a very deeply personal feeling. They had faith in the United States, really. They did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that is why the August 1st speech hit so hard. As the foreign media relations person for Rukh had the responsibility for the accuracy of English language translations from Ukrainian, there was some debate further on that week about the actual title of the document that Ukraine's parliament voted on. Most accurately, it should have been translated as the Act of the Proclamation of Ukrainian Independence. However, I received strong pushback that indeed it was a declaration, a nuance, but important to the independence movement. And the reason, again, was strategic. The leadership wanted to have an immediate association with America's Declaration of Independence. Nuances of translation be damned. In 1996, when the Constitution of Ukraine was fully adopted, the words declaration and declare were made official. And I just want to say that because that's how nitty-gritty it got.
I would also just, important point here about how Ukrainians were really looking forward to Bush and wanted to read for Phil Brady, who was part of the delegation, and he was the head of
He was the secretary of the cabinet
and a good friend of ours. And afterwards he told us that everybody knew that the speech was a bomb. But at the same time, he reported how warmly they felt that they were greeted by people on the street. They sensed that. So, I just wanted to assure, everybody's listening that people did warmly greet Bush, and the Bush delegation understood and felt that, despite what happened in the parliament. But
They did react to that. I talked to people afterwards and they said, Ukrainian people have been very warm. They spoke to all the Rukh leaders and there was a change. And you have to think about 1991. The United States was at the peak of power. The Berlin Wall had fallen down. They had won the Gulf War. Liberal democracy seemed to be the way. So everyone was looking to the United States, and therefore the reluctance to recognize Ukraine right away hurt because the US they basically won the Cold War, and they should have taken credit for that with Ukraine. And I don't, I understand politics and working with a single Gorbachev or working with the center, but the reality was Ukraine was becoming independent. And I can say that, my Polish mother said that we were not a country for 200 years, but we were still Poles. Ukraine was not a country, but they were still Ukrainians.
Well, and I do want to insert here the Drach speech. What was interesting was Irene, he gave it immediately after the Chicken Kyiv speech. And so when we read in the United States, whether it's the New York Times, Washington Post, wherever it was, about his speech, Drach's responses to it weren't delayed for the next day. They were in the same report. So it was all right there. Bush, Drach, Bush, Drach.
I didn't know that because, back then we have to remember there was no, mobile phones, emails were like,
Yeah.
I mean, faxes, if you had, toner, that was a good thing. So yeah, that's good to know. I didn't know that actually. That's good to know. Okay.
We do have a question about who wrote the Chicken Kyiv speech. And it was a collaborative effort, I will say that, and John can speak to that. But the person, the White House speechwriter who took credit for it and had a meeting after they got back with mea culpas was Tony Snow.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
John, I entered because that these things are adjusted at the last minute and so forth.
Right.
So there were other people involved.
There were other people involved, and it showed the thinking within Ed Hewitt, Condoleezza Rice, and in fact, Condoleezza Rice said probably that was one of her worst decisions to allow that speech to go because she was over Tony Snow. And
So
in
you want to
retrospect, it's
you can
easy
get
to
back
say,
to
well, it didn't work. But at that time,
Okay.
there were a lot of people who were reasonable people who said, yeah, we can work with Gorby. He's done all these good things. The one thing Gorbachev and most Russians didn't understand was the nationality issue. And even the dissidents, Solzhenitsyn, or even the writers, if you read Dostoevsky, they believe in a Russian world. They do not believe in Ukrainian independence. So everyone who went through Moscow, whether they're a journalist or a diplomat or a businessman, they got the party line. So it took a long time for them to realize that there is no natural Soviet Union. This is not a collection of states like in the United States. These are people who are forced to be as part of a union they didn't want to be in.
One thing, Nadia is having trouble getting back on, but she's working on it. One thing that happened between the August 1st speech and the 24th was, of course, and it's already been mentioned, the coup. Well, one of the things that I found very interesting was that we lost touch with our Kiev office during that time for several days. And then all of a sudden, I get an email from our office saying, we lost track because of the coup and so forth. We lost any ability to communicate. But he reported that as soon as the coup broke, I don't remember the name, I have it someplace, the general in charge of the Soviet military in Ukraine had Ivan Drach come to his office to tell him that no activity in support of the coup took place in Ukraine by the Ukrainian soldiers of the Soviet Union, and that they had taken an ICBM out of its silo and laid it on its side so that American satellites, they hope, would get a message that all's calm in Ukraine. And when I got that, I reconfigured his memo to me and email fax to Dick Cheney, Jim Baker, Secretary of State, and Colin Powell, National Security Advisor, to let them know. Within an hour, I got a call from Cheney asking if he could maybe get more information. And I told him how, if he wants to get somebody to Ukraine, how to get a hold of our guy who will take him. But it was a very interesting thing that I don't know that's ever been recorded anywhere, that conversation.
And I think it's important to realize that things in history don't automatically happen. Because the coup, back in Washington, they were thinking, well, this was a nice experiment and we're back to old Soviet Union. But Yeltsin standing on a tank, the military going on drawdowns, not only in Ukraine, but Belarus and Kazakhstan. So the coup makers back in Washington, in Moscow, are saying, this is not going to work. We don't have our ducks in a row. So all these things together made them realize they're not going to be able to overturn the government. And Yeltsin played a major role in that as well.
And that is, yes, I mentioned it, but that is to understand that when Ukraine's parliament was meeting on August 24th, in the background, in the back room, playing the entire time, and we on shortwave wave radios on the press galleries were listening to what was going on in the Duma as well, in the Russian Duma, because the communists genuinely were afraid of what Yeltsin was going to do. Even then, Yeltsin had a bit of a reputation as being erratic. I mean, guy gets up on a tank and declares himself to be, president of the Russian Federation. I mean, I'm simplifying it, but you understand what I'm saying. And so they weren't too sure they wanted to hang with this guy. And that was a very important influence for the communists, the hardline communists. The liberal communists were already for independence, but for the hardline communists, is they didn't know what kind of wrath was going to come down on them if Yeltsin came to power.
There's a question here for you, John.
Mm-hmm.
I know the answer, but who is the ambassador in Moscow?
Well, they're the Bob Strauss.
No. I mean, at the time, not after.
Matlock.
Yeah.
And Matlock was a guy who was very knowledgeable. He knew fluent Russian. He studied literature. And I said he's the most knowledgeable guy in Moscow, and he knows a lot of things. Unfortunately, most of it is wrong. But he was a real gentleman, but he has a very Moscow-centric perspective, and the staff did as well. And they were, quick story, when they voted for independence, December 1, they had a press conference, and I was there as well as all the, diplomats. So I have to get up and say what we're going to do. And then, as I'm going to speak, somebody comes from Embassy Moscow, walks in the back of the room, and I know the person, I won't know his name. It was like in The Godfather, when the guy came in from Italy and just sat in the back of the room to intimidate the speaker. So he came in to make sure I did not say we will support independence. I basically said everything other than we will support. It was free and fair election. It represented the will of the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainians have fulfilled the criteria we're talking about, and we were working closely with the Ukrainians. But I could not say at that time, December 2, 1991, that we would support independence.
The Soviet Constitution, specifically Article 72, allowed the right for freely succeed So what was the impediment to recognizing the right by Bush? I mean, the Soviet Constitution sounded pretty good. It just wasn't lived by. That's my answer to that.
There's one part of the Soviet Constitution, I forget the number. It says, this is the overriding thing, that anyone accused or anything that is anti-Soviet activity overrides everything else.
Correct. And that's a really, no joke, laugh, but that was the cudgel with which they controlled a lot of people. That was it. I mean, yes, you have freedom and sure, vote and, we love and we support the people. However, we decide what is right and what is wrong. And if we decide it's wrong, well, too bad for you. John, I just wanted to really underscore, and I don't, and this is for the record, how little Moscow-based journalists who had been in Moscow even for years had no clue what was going on in Ukraine. Literally no clue. They'd never been there.
Yep.
And when Ukraine declared independence, all of a sudden it's like, whoa, wait a minute. There's an overnight train to Kyiv? Okay, let's get on and see what we can do. And they would literally show up and say, well, tell us about Ukraine. Like, you're kidding, right? Like, and honestly, that's the way it was. The one correspondent, which was really, I mean, a lot of them were on top, but one who was super on top of it was Serge Schmeiman, who was then Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times. He knew what was going on. Yeah. He came down somewhere like October, November, right before the December 1st referendum. He met with several people, among them Chornovil. Chornovil had a policy where he refused to speak Russian. So either, and most of them came with Russian translators, so it was me who ended up translating into English. And but Schmeiman, spoke fluent Russian and he spoke fluent English, and they had to go through me, the translator, where I was translating to him in English, and he's like, I get it. And I ran after the interview was over. I ran downstairs with him and I said, I'm trying to apologize. I'm so sorry. Really, you have to understand why. Principle, he doesn't want to do that. And Schmeiman, we're in the back of a cab, and he kind of raises his hand. He goes, I don't care about that. He goes, I just have to think about how I'm going to write this column where I'm going to tell the world that Ukraine is about to change the course of world history.
Mm-hmm. And he's still writing, and he's a very good journalist. The problem was journalists, and I it's not my profession, and I know a lot of good journalists. They would travel a lot. They'd go down to Ukraine, they'd go to Armenia, but they would talk to the leader of the republics, who was usually a local ethnic nationalist who's being watched by the KGB. Sherbitsky in Ukraine was more Catholic than the Pope, or more, he was more of a hardliner. And so that's who they would talk to. So they wouldn't get to see the average person, or Rukh, but there's a couple of others who did a decent job, but unfortunately, they was not the ones who were writing most of the columns.
Nadia, I know we're getting toward the end of our time, and you have a closing which will lead toward what we're going to do when it gets closer to December 1st. But something came up in our discussion, a response to the fellow who wrote the question about the Soviet Constitution. And John and Irene talked about, regardless of what the Constitution could say, you could be penalized if you weren't towing the line. I want to tell the story that the week right after the March 90 parliamentary elections, the Rukh Executive Committee, there's a lot to tell about that, but they got together, and in the course of their meeting, they decided that they were going to write a declaration that put the blame for all the things that had happened against the people of Ukraine on the Communist Party. The ones that were members of the party were in this document going to resign while blaming the party for what had happened in Ukraine over the years. And we watched, Nadia and I were in the room, they wrote out the document, and one by one, these gentlemen, all of them, including all the communists, wrote their names. And I thought I was looking at what happened in 1776 our lives, our sacred honor. They had no idea what the
Yeah.
consequences of what they were doing was going to be, but they did it. And they then waited for the other members of the committee who were in the outlying oblasts voting to get back so they all could sign it. And then they had a press conference and announced it. And I'm telling you, it never made anything in history. But when they put their names on that, they did not know what the consequences would be. And that's why we feel so strongly that those are the founders of Ukraine's current independence and civil society's growth.
Well,
Okay, Nadia, do you
I
want to
think-
wrap up, or can I make my
yes,
comment?
yes. I mean, there are other things. I don't know whether you talked about the hot invasion in September, but we'll leave that for another time.
Yeah.
Thank you all for participating. I hope that everybody got a sense that there is so much more to this history and so much more to know about these men and women who really are the founders of Ukraine's independence. Irena said you could write a book just about Hodin. I think you could probably write a book about each of them. I think you've got a flavor of it. Now, we are going to have another webinar to actually discuss December 1, vote for the referendum, and what was happening in Washington. You know, the meeting that President Bush had with community leaders, the Thursday, whatever, days before the referendum.
The Wednesday before the Sunday vote.
Right, where he said, if Ukraine votes for independence, and of course we were saying, what if John had been writing, telling them it was going to happen, and the fact that it was enumerated what was going to be required for recognition. Robert quickly wrote to Plush, who was then chairman, to itemize what the requirements were. Well, by the time the press conference, the State Department had added a whole bunch of requirements. And then, we know that the referendum passed by over 92% on December 1. But why was U.S. recognition? Why didn't it come until December 25th? And that's going to be the rest of the story. And so we'll be back again to talk about that part, about Ukraine's path. Yes, Irena.
Okay, because I know it's 3:00 and we have to end. And yes, everybody join for December 1 because it's going to be an excellent webinar. I mean that. Today, on the occasion of the 35th anniversary of Ukraine's independence, President Volodymyr Zelensky issued a decree in which he awarded foreign citizens with state awards of Ukraine. And among the 60 awardees, that included foreign prime ministers, heads of various parliaments, U.S. congressional representatives, were also included the U.S.-Ukraine co-founders, Nadia Komenitska-Mikhanov and Robert Mikhanov, who received the second grade Order of Merit. We give you a heartfelt thanks from all of us and a congratulations. But we also must say that part of the Ukraine's Foundation's success for the past 35 years, and Robert and Nadia's work before that, really depended on supporters that supported the foundation because they supported Ukraine. So we encourage, it produced many great results, and we encourage further support. Congratulations to you both. Well deserved.
Well, thank you, Irena. And we couldn't do what we have done all these decades without people. You and I have been, back to 88 for the millennium, and so many others. John, I mean, the credit goes to a lot of people, those who have supported and those with whom we have worked. So onward to victory. Slava Ukraini.
Heroям slava.
Heroям
Thank
slava.
you.
Lava.
Thank you.
Back.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.